Welcome. I'm Stan Galloway, host for the Pier-Glass Poetry Panels, and today's panel explores the poetry of place. We'll be hearing from poets from both sides of the Atlantic. If you're joining us live, we ask you not to use the chat function, but instead send your questions and comments through the Q&A box at our website, pierglasspoetry.wixsite.com/mysite. We'll take a look at those toward the end of the show. But now, to get us started, let's meet our first poet. Nicole Yurcaba is a Ukrainian-American poet and essayist. Her poems and essays have appeared in the Atlanta Review, the Lindenwood Review, Whiskey Island, Raven Chronicles, Appalachian Heritage, North of Oxford, and many other online and in-print journals. Nicole holds an MFA in writing from Lindenwood University and completed a July 2020 writing residency at Gutstad Creative Center for the Arts in Iceland. Nicole's poetry collection, Triskaidekaphobia, is forthcoming in 2022 from the UK press Black Spring Group. She currently serves on the board of the Lost River Education Foundation, works as a high school career counselor for Blue Ridge Community College, and teaches poetry at Southern New Hampshire University. It's a pleasure to welcome you.
Thanks, everybody. I am here. Dr. Galloway invited me to come talk to you about the poetry of place. And so, as he said, I'm Ukrainian American, and Ukraine is a very special place to me and my family. I consider it home. And so today I'm going to share with you 3 poems that I wrote that specifically focus on the current war in Ukraine. The Russians have been in Ukraine now or along the border for the past 7 years. This poem was inspired by a documentary called Invisible Battalion, which portrays all Ukrainian female soldiers who are fighting on the front. And this poem opens with an epigraph from one of the soldiers, and she says, "A woman has the right to defend her country." Gray cats lick muddy paws, decrepit boards warp, sink, disappear. Snipers' bullets find arms, chests, skulls. Soldiers scour bleak horizons. Across a battered steppe, tanks, troops, sentries, line, refute, conflict. Oksana writes her mother, Yulia her husband, Olena her daughter in Ternopil, Andriana smokes, reads Shevchenko, enemy propaganda, the latest intel, the way clouds cursive downward into a field yet to bear wheat. So one thing I want to point out about Ukrainian culture is we've only been an independent nation for the last 25 years. And up until, actually it's more than that. No, it is 1991. Sorry, 30 years. I don't math well. And so in the last 30 years, we've only had our independence, and we're still fighting for the right to speak our own language in our own country, to still practice our own faith, to still have our own identity and our own culture. So one thing that I do in my poetry is I always examine that. Like, even though I'm an American who lives, and a Ukrainian, and I live in the States, I examine about how, some place that's 6,000 miles away can still be home, and how that struggle that Ukrainians face every day in Ukraine is also my struggle because I'm part of that culture. And I, as a poet, have the responsibility to carry on that culture and our traditions and our language in my poetry. The poem is called Ice Cubes in Glass, and I have known for over half my life. I tell him what it is to fill the ice cube tray, then spill it when I'm halfway to the freezer. Puddles formed on unmopped linoleum, edges running, curving, undefined. Meanwhile, 80,000, 50,000, 40,000 depending on the media outlet, Russian troops line an eastern border. I think of July, Kiev, Dnipro, Pirohiv, the buckwheat crop, the wattle fence, my bare feet in my ancestors' shadow. And so one thing about Ukrainian culture is we celebrate ourselves, we celebrate our landscapes, and we recognize that we would not be a people without the land. And we have this concept of homeland that we carry with us, and we celebrate our ancestors constantly in our art, in our writing. From little up, we're reading poetry and reciting poetry and learning these traditions. So like most of you probably don't know this about me, but I'm also a Ukrainian embroideress. I sew the traditional vijibanka, as we call them. And that's something that's passed down from generation to generation. And this next poem is kind of, it harkens to, the folklore and to heritage. There's a very famous painting in Ukrainian culture called At the Wattle Fence. And it's a young man and a young woman, and she's dressed in the traditional Ukrainian costume with her flowered head wreath and her vest and her skirt. And they're just looking at one another, and you can tell that there's something romantic between them. I wrote this poem, and it's called You Will Meet Me in the Meadow. And it has an epigraph from the Ukrainian red Kalina. An epigraph is, close to where the field tapers into dense forest, like a serpent's tail, blunt tip, meeting its mouth somewhere in a black sea's depths. Meet me at the wattle fence, where Mikola once met Anna during a windy April day. Her hair blew into her eyes, dark, round, wide, cast downward at her bare feet. Meet me at the wattle fence, close to the plot bearing a second crop of buckwheat, the harvest near. I'll tell you how August creeps into September without regards. Date unknown, the frost hush will fall.
Thank you. That was a moving poem, and I'm always astonished at how well I see the landscape through your writing. Just so grateful that you're able to capture in so few words not only the visual aspect of that culture, but also the emotional aspect of it. It was well done. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, let's look at our next poet. Andrew Manyika is a world-class poet and comedian from Zimbabwe. Nominated for the 2020 Outstanding Comedian NAMA Award, his deft touch with pen and voice has made him a standout act in his country and continent, where he has been featured at several top-tier festivals. In 2017, he was the first Zimbabwean to perform at the Bridgewater International Poetry Festival, the Golden Pony, and the Backdoor Comedy Club. In 2019, he released his poetry chapbook, Man of Letters, and in 2021, debuted his movie review web series, Andy Takes On YouTube. Andrew, we're glad you could join us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Stan. I'm very glad I could be here today. I heard in the review that you mentioned that I was at the Backdoor Country Club. I don't know if they have a country club, but I would love to go perform there if the opportunity avails. All right. Okay, so today, under the theme of poetry of place, I'm going to perform or recite 3 poems, 4 actually. And I'm going to just give a brief intro of each poem as we get into it. But as you've highlighted, I am Zimbabwean, and when I'm able to, I really enjoy performing and traveling to do so. So this first poem looks at a failed attempt that I made to travel to the United States to come and perform there. This was for the Bridgewater 2019 festival. And despite the fact that I had successfully applied to and come and perform at the 2017 edition, but this time I was not so successful. So I'm just going to recite this poem called Migration Request Denied. She said, Zim is too hard for you to want to return. But hard is what Zim is, or haven't you learned that we are housemates, rocks, water, a land that is landlocked, no water. And I was born from this, screaming. The air flowing between my lungs is the same wind blowing between the rungs of the rocks on our great stone monument. And I was made from this, teeming. Within my veins is blood pulling as if by reins to see the world and all that it contains. But I know how to return. I know what it is to unfamiliar ground for your remains. So maybe when God made you, he took the fine sand of a dusty beach, and when he made me, igneous rock was all that he had within reach. But still he strung me together with fear and wonder, so that no matter where I wander, just as the tide turns, I have learned that apart from where I stand, there are parts of who I am that I carry within my brittle bones, like echoes of sticks and stones, like beacons leading me home. Some of the references or the allusions in that poem refer to the Great Zimbabwe, which isn't just an ego trip that the country's leaders had, but the name of a monument that we have in the place where Zimbabwe was founded, as it were, called Masvingo, where there are ruins called the Great Zimbabwe Ruins. And they are actually a bit of a marvel in the archaeological circles because the entire structure is made from stones that are laid one over the other, making arches and bridges and buildings, but all of this without any mortar. So it's quite a unique structure there. This second poem was written at a time when I lived in South Africa. Now, in 2008, when South Africa was not quite a fledgling democracy, but was 14 years old, there arose the first in a series of xenophobic attacks. Now, these attacks were ostensibly on the grounds that people, this is South African locals, were being marginalized by the arrival of foreign nationals like myself. And the arguments varied from they are here to take our jobs to they are here to take our women to they are here to take our places in university and things of this nature. Now, just so that I'm very explicit about this, it wasn't all South Africans, but it seemed to be happening in pockets. These pockets were isolated to primarily impoverished areas in South Africa where the gap between the haves and the have-nots was most apparent. So these attacks became quite violent to the extent that I think the most visceral and most visual of them was when a man was burned alive. They have this thing that used to happen in South Africa called necklacing, where you would have a rubber tire draped around your neck, and then that would be set fire to with you still wearing it, hence necklacing. And there was a man who was captured on camera with this entire thing happening to him. And so when I saw that, it sort of inspired this next poem. The poem is called Crimes of Geography. It began in a newspaper, which of course was a lie because nothing begins in newspapers. Things just begin to be seen in them. A newspaper, sheets of paper put together, formerly blank pages crammed with words, pictures portraying imperfectly a few of the many hues of our imperfection. More bad news. Strangers had died. And whilst living in this age, there was nothing unusual in reading such, I was touched. They were a different kind of stranger, like me. And they died as an outlet for the worst kind of anger. They died giving meaning to the headline, Xenophobic Attacks Claim Lives, which in reality means nothing. Because a phobia cannot raise a knife or a gun or a fist. It won't break down your door in the hours before dawn, demanding your ID book, breath baited, waiting to hear your response, your accent, and from it to sift where you respond. No, it won't take a knife or a gun or a fist to your face for this, the crime of geography, that having been born elsewhere, you had the audacity to then come here. It won't shoot you once in the chest, then again in the stomach, because although you were born here, you won't help to remove these strangers. My kind of strangers. My kind. The phobia won't, but a person can. People did. It began with a man named Jacob Ntuli. I wish it had only ended with him acting unruly in Alexandra the Small. He and a loudspeaker walked up and then down and made a call. Perhaps in his beginnings it was not a call to arms. Only he and his God can say if he intended that people be done any harm, but they answered his call. And in his abode assembled one and all, and I have never seen the unburdening of the chests of a people grow weary of the dreary pace of life in a tunnel, seemingly without end or light. There assembled 1,000 strangers, their thoughts, their hurts, their afflictions of the soul, bare on the floor and about to be doused in anger, and lit by the fire of their burning desires. Something in their assembly sparked their ire, and the turning spires of their collective mind, a thought was born: revolution, resolution, resolute. Dogged determination decided that the source of their afflictions was not from amongst themselves, could not even in part be they themselves. They looked without, disregarded doubt, and fixed their collective gaze upon strangers like me, my kind of stranger, my kind. And later, when they asked him, Jacob truly said, we never meant for them to get killed, but had resolved to remove them. Oh, well, I guess that's all right then. He kindled a fire and foolishly fanned the flames in a forest one can not easily put out. What does he dream about at night? Does he scream out loud from the fright of the flaming faces that forbid him the respite of sleep? Time will only one day tell the tale of whether his resolution has been a solution. Rain blessings on the keepers of the peace among a people who choose between the work to destroy or the work to build and have chosen the easier. Mobs are provinces determined to steal, kill, and destroy, leaderless, ruthless, effective. But those called to keep peace have always needed to be led, to be unified, and have always been fewer. Mobs, designed in such a way as to cushion the collective consciences of their members who will congregate to dismember a stranger whose only crime is that of geography. Convened to do things, not one of them will stand alone in the light to say that in doing this, I stand in the right. It boggles and baffles the mind how people will seek out and find a way that works to hurt but fall into the rhapsody of apathy when they need to find work and longevity. Marvelous is the method and tremendous the technique, but seductively selected, choosing to forget that even this country was not born in this age. And in the book of its history, to turn back 14 pages would reveal helter-skelter, the locals seeking shelter, craving a haven in the bosom of the mothers that birthed the whelps they now refuse to help. But the strangers of my kind have had to learn that even while time goes forward, the arc of a pendulum swings back, then forth, then back again. The tremendously treacherous pursuit of havens for us, the perfectly persecuted, having to learn to traverse the tightrope of a life in which falling on either side means being bruised and bludgeoned by a maelstrom of fists whose owners say that they just want you to leave or they only want to rule you forever. Have you ever observed the behavior of an animal in fear? Short, sharp, shallow breaths, restlessly roving retina, nose in the air, sniffing for the scent of danger, limbs paused in mid-motion, ready to shoot off at a moment's notice. Ears like lost antenna listening for the sound, perhaps the sound of hope, but only hearing talk of inquisitions into the cause, while another body burns. And like an animal that just doesn't know, we've learned that all the different postures of fear. And in my mind, I hold the paintbrush and don't want to use it to paint a whole nation in one stroke, but this nation, this rainbow is bleeding and it's running red. I want to lay it to rest by saying that it's fine and God sees it, but I can't because the one is true and the other is not. God sees it, but it can't be fine, not whilst lives go up in smoke. Have you ever seen a man burning alive, but with his arms not flailing about and from his mouth not escaping a sound? Do you not wonder at the type of despair that causes a man to resign himself to death so listlessly, so completely? Do you ever think what that kind of silence sounds like amid the acrid smell of smoke and burning flesh and the crackling sound of the flames? That silence is the sound of a soul leaving and of remaining behind. So I wish I could say that that was the last of the attacks that took place in South Africa, but every few years, it has happened that there have been the same kind of pressures and outbursts. But relationships between the two countries do remain cordial. And again, it's not reflective of the South African society, but when it does happen, it does feel a little bit like the sky is falling. This next poem, as I mentioned, I lived in South Africa for about 8 years. Before that, I lived in Zimbabwe for 16. But even within that, I was moving from place to place quite a bit. So two things I know about life for certain. Moving sucks, especially when you have to pack the little things like spoons and forks and plates, because you have to pack each one individually. But also, I know the particular kind of sadness that comes with having to say goodbye to a place in a very final sort of way. And so this poem that reflects this is called Wondering Why While Wondering Where. And the two lines that begin the two stanzas are time spent walking the earth wears down the sole, as in sole of a shoe, and the other one's time spent walking the earth wears down the soul, as in the heart of a person. And so time spent walking the earth wears down the soul. Dusk. Whilst packing the last of our prized possessions, moving things we thought we'd planted and letting emptiness reprise its position, we turn our home into a mere house, and I come across an old pair of shoes. They are well worn, and from the process of so becoming are worn down. Scuffed at the front and warm to the feel, torn at the heel, I try to remember them being new, and all the places they've been since then. It amuses me to think that shoes having a tongue but no eyes cannot speak of all the places that they've seen since then. So these shoes that have moved me through every plausible place, I now remove to put them away. In so doing, I catch sight of the heel and its curvature strikes me. I am wondering where the rubber that has been the soul has gone. In leaving its imprint on the earth, did it also leave little pieces of itself behind, like calling cards for the ground? And all that displaced dust, did it creep into the grooves of the soul so that knowingly or not, I brought little pieces of everywhere here to our home, which once these shoes are packed, will become only a house. In them, I've walked so many miles, so many miles. Time spent walking the earth wears down the soul. Home. We packed everything that needed packing and stacked every box that needed stacking. In a stranger's gut, my home, I say as little as possible because every sound now carries an echo, and every echo makes it harder to let go and realize that this is no longer my place. As silence takes hold of every audible space, I stand looking at the thin film of dust on all the surfaces. You grab my arm and we remark together how it settled so easily on our dreams. Little pieces of everywhere stifling little pieces of us. Dreams die slow deaths, and there is nothing gentle about their passing. All it takes for a pen to bleed is in the right place, a touch, and a little pressure. As tears blur my vision, I think perhaps my soul is much like that. You grab my arm again and tell me, it's time. You are not wrong. We have filled the quota of memories to be made here, and it's a long way to the new house. Between here and there are so many miles, so many miles. And finally, I'm going to perform or recite a poem from my book, Man of Letters, ruthless self-promotion and plugging here. But I'm very proud of this book. It's my debut collection of poetry called Man of Letters. Some short poems that I wrote because I finally had to put something down in a book. And this one is called Goodbye, which again, if you've moved around as much as I have, you then start to get accustomed to having to have that kind of interaction with people. And it was partially inspired by an old Irish folk song that I really like called The Parting Glass. First time I heard that song was sung by a group called the Irish Rover, which is also the name of the song. But the album is called the Irish Rover. And well, this is the poem Goodbye. Goodbye. Word built like granite, granting more of take than give, made with more of dye then live, leaving, bitter aftertaste, after every time I depart in haste, leaving often never feeling the full force of my departure, fearful that underneath it I would come undone, that I would splinter and break, that I would shudder and shake, that I would stumble and fall, that I would crumble, and all that would remain in my wake is smithereens and splintered dreams and crimson streams and little things, a collage of brokenness. So I steal myself away, counting down the day. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for giving me this time, Stan. Back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always a pleasure listening to you recite your work. I love how that you are able to embody not only a sense of place, but a meditation about it while you're doing it. And I think that's an important aspect of what you do, is that you don't just see, but you look for meaning underneath the seeing. And I find that very important in your work.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Let's move to our third presenter for the day. Jeff Sommerfeld, co-founder, co-editor-in-chief of Sky Island Journal, and host of its companion podcast, Voices from the Sky, is an educator and lifelong learner who believes the two are inextricably linked. His reading palette is as diverse as his professional writing background. He developed successful litigation strategies for Fortune 500 clients, secured millions of dollars in grant funding for nonprofit organizations, and held the role of lead writer for a professional sports website. With over a decade of teaching experience, he has served graduate and undergraduate students at the University of Arizona and secondary students throughout the United States. Born and raised in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, he and his wife reside near Milwaukee. We're so happy you could join us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Stan. This is just wonderful to be here, and it's going to be tough to follow up Drew and Nicole. So thank you both so very, very much for sharing so much of yourselves and sharing your gift, sharing your craft today. It's something that I have the pleasure of doing with my podcast. I love being able to sit and talk with writers and talk with poets about their creations. And as I speak to you today as the full group here, I'm going to be coming at it from a little bit different angle and perspective as an editor of a literary journal. And at Sky Island Journal, we publish works from established authors. We take works from people that sometimes when they are published by us, it's the very first time they've ever been published in their entire lives. And so we read blindly. We want to experience the work for its own merit. And once we decide we want to publish a piece, then we reach out and we ask for the bios and all of that. And so today I'm going to feature three poems that all three of them are rooted in place, as Stan had given me the prompt to think about. And I think I've been reflecting so much so on this idea of place and the importance that it has for us as people, for poetry as it becomes a reflection of that human experience. And there's so many places for us that they carry so much weight. They matter so much to us. It's where we make discoveries. It's where our memories come flooding back to us. It's, where we develop a sense of loyalty or a sense of belonging, or the different aspects, the different layers of our identity. And over the years, these places, oftentimes these physical places, it's a continuum for us. And what that place means to us now might be very different from what it meant prior. And so to be able to chronicle that through poetry, through our writing, I think becomes really important, so that 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, we don't lose sight of the person that we were and how we were responding to that place in the moment. And to be able to share that with others is such an incredible experience. For me, I grew up, I'm reaching out to you here from Catholic Memorial High School in Waukesha, Wisconsin, but it's just outside of the Milwaukee metro area. I love living in an urban setting. I can ride my bike to the ballpark and watch the Brewers play baseball. But I grew up in the country. I grew up in farm country in Wisconsin, a little township called Jim Falls. And we were right along Old Abe Lake. When I was a kid, Old Abe Lake, that was home to me. And that place held that particular sense of identity. And when I was 9 years old, when our house burned down and we lost everything, all of a sudden that place literally made me sick to my stomach to imagine getting in a car driving to that place. It was a place of destruction. It was a place of loss. And as the years have gone by, we never rebuilt on that land, but that land we returned to. We go to Old Abe Lake and we fish in the evenings, we fish in the mornings. My father has a vegetable garden there, and it's now a place where it's a place of serenity. It's a place that gives us literally sustenance for our bodies, but also for our minds and for our souls. And my partner, Jason, and I, when we developed Sky Island Journal, it was rooted in place. And for us, what I want to do at the top here is just read a little portion from our website, Sky Island Journal, that explains how the place, the mountains of New Mexico, inspired these two boys from the Midwest to develop our journal with that sensibility. And so we ask a question on our website that says, what's in a name? Everything, really. In the southern reaches of Arizona and New Mexico, where our journal was born, Sky Islands are small, isolated mountains that rise up dramatically like bright battleships from the flat sea of desert that surrounds them. Physically separated from other mountain ranges and much higher in elevation than the surrounding desert, Sky Islands are a refuge for exotic species found nowhere else. Animals that only migrate vertically, and species that have found themselves stranded by a continually warming climate. Known for their ecological diversity, many Sky Islands are places where species from radically different biomes meet and mingle. Conversely, some promote extreme specialization in the species isolated there. Sky Islands loom large in human culture as well. They're the homelands of the Apache, the Pima, the Tohono O'odham, and at one time, Sky Islands formed the beating northern heart of Old Mexico. After the Gadsden Purchase of 1854, they became the collective muse of ranchers and raiders, writers and warriors, painters and potters, home to the lawful and the lawless, the indigenous and the immigrant alike. Isolated yet inclusive, Sky Islands are home to the lean and the rugged, the specialized and the independent, the tenacious and the beautiful. They're home to the native as well as the exotic. They're home to those who would rather see than be seen. Home to the wild and the wild at heart. They're our favorite places because we can relate to them. Sky Islands embody everything we appreciate about writers and writing. Our publication's birthplace and spiritual home is in Luna County, New Mexico. The Florida Mountains Wilderness Study Area is our muse. Its landscape is the source of our positive energy, our rugged independence, and our relentless tenacity. Since our inception in 2017, we now have over 80,000 readers in 145 different countries and a family of over 500 contributors hailing from all over the globe. Each year, we return to that place in Deming, New Mexico, to listen, to learn, and to guide the next steps we take. For myself and for Jason, the two of us, being there in that physical space is so incredibly important for everything that we've done and everything we will continue to do with this journal. And I think about it sometimes, my wife and I, when we joke about interview questions that ask, oh, if you could have any superpower, what would that superpower be, right? For both of us, it's almost always teleportation, right? Especially when we're about to get ready for like a long road trip or something. And I think that's something poetry can do, right? We can literally transport from one place to another. Maybe it's a place we've been and now we get to see it through somebody else's eyes. Or maybe it's somewhere we've never been and we'll never have the opportunity to visit in our own lifetime. And a poet can take you there, like Drew and Nicole did for us today. When we think about the types of poems that we look to publish at Sky Island, we don't do thematic issues. We don't say, you know, in the month of October, we want poems about X, Y, Z. I think the one thing that we always want for sure is something that transports us. It transports us intellectually, transports us emotionally, and we always encourage writers or poets who are thinking about possibly submitting their work to us to read a few issues, to get a sense of who we are and what type of work typically can be found within the online pages of our journal. And while we don't have thematic issues, I think a pattern definitely starts to develop, with outliers, of course, but poems that are rooted in place, I think, are very much so a part of what we love and appreciate. And I think the place where the poem is written often forms the lens with which we see the world. What's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what's dangerous, what's safe, what matters, what doesn't matter. It's all connected to place. And so the first poem that I want to share with you is from Lisa Critch Bledsoe. She's a tremendous poet from North Carolina. And the name of the poem is Night on Spring River. This is one I immediately imagine the 57-mile river through Missouri and Arkansas. And in the opening line, she's going to make it really clear with the voice that the lens, the perspective of seeing this place is that of a child, an adult looking back at an experience that they had as a child. So here's Night on Spring River by Lisa Critch Bledsoe. It was unbearably hot, if you ask my mother, but I didn't know that. We arrived in a swirl of red dust and the scent of shortleaf pine, and now my clothes were stiff, my hair water-combed into sticks and smelling of river belly and bees with sun under their wings. What I knew was that we were sleeping out by a real fire on a riverbank at night, and there was no bed. In amazement. My father dragged our canoe out of the water, tilted it on its side, and strung a tarp from the canoe in a slant to the brown river sand. Beneath was a quilt. My mother said I could be in the middle, but I wanted the edge. We were sleeping by a river under a canoe next to the stars, sharp as little knives. I needed to see the moon's violet bowl, to be brand new at the edge and end of the world. The time of green flux singing and falling around me in silk strings, to hear the clicking of fancies and phantasms amid a river wine stir of shadow. If such a place were possible, I might weather the years when something closed and sealed the hidden banks beneath my inner breath and course. If such a bed were made, this rich draught might show me my own way home, as if I knew my home, my way, my own one night to hold open the great heart of the world, so we can heal before we die, dancing up the clouds, climbing the smoke from our fire to another place, stamps on letters from far away. It's in these opening stanzas that the speaker pulls us into this literary world, and we have these vivid descriptions where we're right there. And what happens in the fourth stanza is absolutely critical. The speaker says, I wanted the edge. She could play it safe. She could stay right there tucked in the cocoon between her mom and dad. But she says, no, I need to be on the edge. I need to experience that. I need to be here, fully here. That experience within that place, it's like breaking the eggshell. And all of a sudden, that world that you thought you knew, you see something completely different, and you're transformed. Throughout our lives, we break all kinds of eggshells as we go. And for a child to take this kind of calculated risk for the right reason is absolutely essential. And it's not something that she could have done sitting in front of a blinking screen with a PS4 or even with her friends in a basement at a sleepover. You learn other things there. But here, in this place, it was absolutely key. I think the other thing that Lisa is doing here is, yes, she pulls us in these opening moments. And then as we shift into this final stanza, it's kind of like the wind up and then the pitch, right? And that pitch is just a thing of beauty when we get to that final stanza. It's one of the most beautiful strings of words I've had the pleasure of speaking. It's like the final lines, the final page of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. The first time I read it, I had tears. The second poem I want to talk about structurally does something kind of similar. Benjamin Green, in his poem At Dusk, he also has kind of that wind up and then the pitch. But for him, the eloquence comes right away. And when we get to the end, that pitch is kind of like the sounding of a bell or a gong. This one's called At Dusk by Benjamin Green. At dusk, the shape of the canyon is described by fog, a blurred ghost of the creek itself, and the moon is a smudge of silence in the plum-colored sky, its face chiseled by the sharp-pointed rasp of juniper. Up close, the water in a creek gives shine to the micro-reflection of light, bathes in the hard darkness of stone. On the far bank, a gang of juncos hunkers under willows. Remember the first time you saw something wild that looked you in the eye. You can feel this for yourself, how large forces work on tiny lives. As we move into this third stanza here and the reflection comes up, we're not talking about the myth of Narcissus and Echo here, looking at the reflection back. It's being able to see beyond ourselves and see that panoramic view of this place, of this world. And through that, that's where we gain the understanding. What Benjamin Green is doing here that's similar to Lisa is he doesn't tell us what to think or feel. He provides an opportunity to enter into this literary world. And especially when we get to that question, remember the first time something wild looked you back in the eyes? Where you've been, what you've seen, what you've experienced, that's what you see when you close your eyes, and on the eyelids, the screen that forms there from your memory of that experience, each and every one of you, it's different based on your experience. And Green makes that possible. Whether you feel fear or you feel that sense of belonging or an acceptance of our own mortality or an understanding that in this vast world, we're nothing. We're just a flash in the pan in this place that has been here longer than we have and will be here much longer after we've gone. He opens that opportunity, and it's all rooted in the place. The last piece that I want to share with you structurally works quite differently. And what Lori does is, I guess if I'm going to use a sports analogy, is it's kind of like a boxer, just like jabs back and forth all the way through. And sometimes those jabs, you might just brush them off, but you never know which one's going to be the knockout punch for you. This one's called Survival's Counterweight by Lori Ness. Brittle is a herd thing, the call and response of pampas grass and static air, a sound native to drought. Quail sought shelter, nesting deep inside its golden blades. When forage ran out, cows chewed prickly pear. Pain became the price of water. I fenced off this oasis from the race between mouth and monsoon. Fostering survival is an illusion of will. Nature leads with continuity, finishes with sacrifice. I kneel to look. The grassy bowl is empty, its slopes pristine. Below the barbed wire, tracks braid the sand, 2 toes and a pad, the signature of coyote. Rustling stalks beckoned when all other cover was gone. There is balance within the wreckage. Eggs bursting with rain inside an arid mouth. Stan is sharing out the links for these poems that open up as a Word document. And if you look at the way that this is set up, the way that the stanzas line up, and Lori is using the indentations, this piece kind of works like a puzzle that could be solved many correct ways. You could read this all as the couplets of the 3-line and the 2-line pairs. You could read all the 3 lines together and they form a message. You could read all the 2 lines together and they form a message. And the craft is there the whole time, but you never see it. And I think that's one of the beauties of this poem, and I think something that Lisa and Benjamin are doing as well, is they make their shift within the poem. The craft has always been there, but you just never know it because you're so wrapped up in the place and the message. And it's what I just love about these pieces. The bonus poem that I'm including in the notes is actually one of Stan's that we had the pleasure of publishing and nominating in 2019 for a Pushcart Prize, Heron's Ark. And it's definitely worth checking out if you've never read that poem from Stan as well. And the things that I gushed over here, I could do the very same thing for Stan as well. So thank you all for this opportunity to share this info.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that editor's eye, but also the thing that I noticed that was in contrast, rightfully so, is that both Nicole and Andrew looked at place from through the lens of homeland, through what is home, and the poems that you chose to share with us from Sky Island were ones that were looking at a place other than home, and I thought that was also important. And so I might come back to Nicole and Andrew and ask you to think about the relationship of home to not home in a moment. I want to point out the links that Jeff referred to are on our website. You can go look at the poems there. That's also where our question and answer box is. Now is the time for you to be sending in those questions for us to look at. But I want to think about that juxtaposition, or that interweaving of the familiar and the unfamiliar. The sense of this is where I'm comfortable and this is where I'm not comfortable, and why. And wonder if any of you want to embrace a little bit of that conversation before we go to questions.
Yes, and all right. So if I'm getting you, it's home as the comfort zone or the place of familiarity, and then not home as the place where it's completely the opposite and you're on unfamiliar ground. Do you mean like would we be open to embracing that, like in the writing of new poetry? Sorry, I'm looking down because I've got 2 screens in front of me, so I'm paying maximum attention. Like, would you mean like in terms of embracing that in new poetry that we write, or how do you?
I think whether you recognize that you either have grappled with that distinction, or whether it's a potential ground for you to grapple with in a poem. I think it can work either way.
Okay, I think for me personally, I have grappled with it, and it's I suppose a storied background. All right, so my mom, her mother is from Malawi. I'm from Zimbabwe. I lived 8 years in South Africa. I spent some time in America when I came with you, and all of these things then go on to inform I suppose it becomes more of a question of identity, as in which place do you identify with, which place do you feel most at home. When I get stopped at the airport, sometimes I'm told that I look Somalian, and or that I don't look Zimbabwean, which I don't, to this day, I don't know what that means. I think Zimbabweans just look like people from Zimbabwe. So home then becomes a very fluid thing. For me, I have grappled with the idea, and for me, I suppose, been a subconscious decision to then make home less about physical places as much as about certain people and the experiences that I know that I'll have with them, so that your home, in my case, then becomes more about an experience that you can have either with a group of people or with a particular person.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that that it's probably, I mean, just not everyone has your international residency resume to draw on, but I think all of us have travel in one form or another that informs. Yeah, I think you used the word identity. You know, who we are is often made up, like your poem about the soul, little pieces of us that are left everywhere, but also that are picked up everywhere that we move. Anyone else want to respond to that idea?
Yeah, this is something that I think about a lot when I write poetry, because this is going to sound so awkward to most of you. I feel more familiar in Ukraine and other European countries. I feel more at home and accepted there than I do in the United States. And so it's very difficult for me to write about experiences in the United States, like things that I can, of things that I faced here. And you know, a good example is like going through to TSA. That's a terrifying event for me. Because I always get pulled, I always get chem swabbed. You know, we play the game of 1,000 questions, and most people would look at me and think, well, why does that happen? You know, and there are a lot of, you know, circumstances I won't get into that, you know, why I'm flagged and things like that. So like I struggle with this a lot in my poetry. And if it's something you're facing in your own poetry, just keep writing about it. Because eventually, you know, I think that's a coping mechanism in itself. I have to write about those as a coping mechanism. Maybe that's more complex than what you were looking for, Dr. Galloway.
No, that I think that's not only heartfelt, but universal in its specificity. You know, all of us have something that we struggle with in terms of either identity or, you know, treatment, that each of us has to cope with in one way or another. And I know that many poets do that through their poetry and through their through the images, if not overtly, through the you know, as I mentioned with Andrew, through his ability to not only see what is there, but to see what's underneath what is there. And I think that that's also true of your work, that, you know, it's not just the wattle fence that you're looking at, you know, in, you know, generations and cultures that meet there, not just the, you know, the man and the woman in the painting. Okay, I don't know, Morgan, have we had any questions come in?
We haven't gotten any questions, but I have gotten a comment. If you want me to read that out.
Yeah, go ahead.
This person says, not a question, but a comment for Drew. As someone who has moved several times and moved from somewhere I lived for a long time last year, your poem Wondering Why While Wondering Where really spoke to me and feelings I have experienced. So thank you so much for sharing it. I was very glad to read it. And for all poets, these ponderings on what home is has been really good for me to listen to.
Thank you. I'm very grateful that the poem has touched you in that way, and thank you for that feedback. It really does mean a lot. I think most of us as poets know what it feels like to not be sure if you're speaking into the void when you write, and having meetings online doesn't really help with that. So thank you. It really does mean a lot to know that it's connected. Anonymous.
Yeah, and if you have questions, be sure to get them in right away. And I want to thank all of you for the work that you shared with us today. But beyond that, as this comment suggested, for what it means underneath, for sharing a part of your life and not just words, for sharing, for reaching out and saying, this is what I experienced, whatever you are experiencing like this, let's share that together. And it's not the same, none of us have as I said earlier, the same resume that we bring to a poem, but we all have our own. And I think that's one of the important things about poetry of place, is that no matter what the place is, there are places that we cherish, places that we dread, places that are like the wide open space that we just have to get through. And that was not a physical description of the United States, though some people might have recognized certain states in those statements. But I think that place is so much literal, but so much also metaphoric in and this exploration that we've done today in what place means. I hope is only the starting place for many of you as you're thinking about, how do I get at this feeling? Well, maybe there's a place involved that goes with that. And I'm thinking now of poets who maybe are at the beginnings of their careers, and that you want to write about loneliness, but you've already written 14 poems called Loneliness. So, how do I get at this? And maybe it is, beside a river at night, or maybe it is, I love that phrase, the stars were tiny knives. Maybe that's your moment, that's your place. Or maybe it's a place you've never been, a place you've read about, a place that you want to go someday. Something in you yearns to see the Eiffel Tower. That becomes your poem. Even though it's a place you haven't been to. Other thoughts from our poets, or from Morgan, whoever wants to jump in?
If I may, Stan, I think what you were saying was particularly poignant for me. As we continue this discussion, I'm realizing that the importance of place is maybe linked to the importance of poetry. And what I'm struggling to say, but now I'll find the words, is that place can be then like seen as a repository for emotion. You know how maybe you smell a meal that you last smelled when your mom made it when you were 5 or whatever, and it brings back those memories. And how, especially I liked it from what Jeff presented, where the different emotions that really came through by virtue of the descriptions of place and the emotions that came with them. I felt like it was a very powerful vehicle for being able to convey the emotion of either a time in a person's life, which was, I think, the first poem that you read was about from a young girl's perspective, or about a new experience, which was the last poem that you read. I really enjoyed that. I think it's a big revelation for me right now.
Okay, anything else? All quiet on Morgan's end?
We do have another question.
Oh, good.
It says, and I'm not sure who it's from right now, so I'm not sure who said the first part, but it says, firstly, hi again, Professor Yurcaba, I miss you. And the question is for any and all poets to answer. It says, how do you all connect the place to where you come from without explicitly stating it? Better yet, how do you connect with past experiences or current ones and implement them into your writing?
So I'll throw out some ideas here. I think for me, like when I first started writing about being Ukrainian and my experiences and, that sense of self that I have from having this attachment to the homeland, like I always felt like I needed to mention Ukraine, like specifically in the poem. That what I needed to do was show. So it really does go back to like the images that you show. It can also be a matter of what language you use. Because even though my poetry is primarily written in English, I often find myself going back to using Ukrainian words and Ukrainian phrases in my poems, and giving a footnote that's a translation. So that's how I tackle that issue. As for past experiences, could you read that part of the question again, Morgan?
How do you connect with past experiences or current ones and implement them into your writing?
Okay, so this is the importance of journaling, because journaling makes you more self-aware. And I'll share this tidbit. Since August 23rd, 2005, I have filled 289 handwritten volumes. I am a sick person, I admit it. But I chronicle everything. It's everything from what music did I listen to that day to what happened in the news, and it becomes like this depository that I can go back to. And, when I'm out of something to write about, I can go and get a prompt. Or if I'm like, okay, I remember this incident happening, maybe I have something in a journal that tells me, and I find myself going back through my journal. So that's that as like on a personal level. Now, if you're talking about like past experiences, like historical events, that's where research becomes your friend. I can write about Ukraine's place in World War II. I wasn't there. Okay, so I have to go and actually read books and do research and put myself in the place of characters and novels and things like that. I can interview people, of course. So that's kind of how I deal with that task.
Right, well, for me, all right, so we're speaking about drawing on past or present experiences, and whilst Nicole asked you to read the last part of the question, I'm going to ask you to give me the first part of the question again, Morgan.
How do you all connect the place to where you come from without explicitly stating it?
All right. I think much like Nicole, when the question of allusion to a place as opposed to direct reference to a place, for me personally, maybe it's by dint of my writing process, I like to layer things or to conceal the meaning of a thing so that you sort of have to work to get to it. So if I was to directly, maybe not so much reference as to go into a detail about a place, let's say Zimbabwe, for example, which is where I'm from, I wouldn't then want to say Zimbabwe is like this, or when you go to this particular place in Zimbabwe, you will find these rocks there. Because for me, it feels like it's a bit too on the nose, which is a personal preference, which is not to say that if one were to do it, one would have done something wrong. I like to allude to or to make reference to things that then are unique to that place. We've got a place here called Chinoi Caves, which is a series of caves where you will find it have been turned into a tourist attraction. So you can talk about then Chinoi as a place without then trying to make it about the whole, or you can talk about the caves, sorry, without then trying to make it about the whole town. So I like to allude in a subtle way that sort of nudges you towards the subject at hand. I hope that helps. I'm not sure. But when it comes to drawing from experiences, I am terrible at using present experiences to draw from for poetry, and it's because I think the way I'm wired, I sort of like to prefer to go through the thing and then look at it in retrospect, and then work through my feelings about what happened or what I've done or what is happening in the world at large. My writing process in general entails that a lot of um, in another life in my mind as opposed to in my real body. I feel like I go through a free writing exercise and then try to pick the pieces from there. But what actually happens is that I'll go through days of just trying to jot down the feelings or the experiences or phrases that I think are relevant to an experience until I hear a voice in the back of my head saying, "That's enough now, my child." And then from there, I'll then try and piece them together into a poem. So it's sort of like you're sculpting a poem out of a rough rock until it sort of fits together in a way that makes some sort of narrative sense.
Yeah, I love what both Andrew and Nicole are talking about here. And the journaling is so incredibly helpful to have that sense of self and have that place to go where you find this is what I want to speak about. This is what I want to explore a little further. And for Andrew to talk about looking at things in retrospect. And so often for me, there are times where I'll have a poem that I want to work on that is about a specific place. And if I start with the place, I tend to spin my wheels quite a bit. And so I try to spend time first thinking about, well, what was I feeling within that place? What are the emotions that are attached there? What are some things that can perhaps be universal from this experience that was really personal for me, but how do I make this accessible for my readers? And if I start to think of it in that terms, and I think about what did I learn from this experience, what was I feeling at that time, I can start to use the thing or the place as the vehicle that actually moves to the real thing that I want to explore within this poem. And Andrew talks about something else as he was talking. The word that I heard in my head, but he didn't say, was restraint. And there are times when there are details, there's specificity that I might want to include, but as I go back and I look at drafts, I sometimes have to figure out a way to get out of my own way and to let go of some of my ego and say, you know, that was a really clever line that I just put together there, but is it going to resonate for my readers? Are they going to have to pull out, you know, a book? Are they going to have to Google search and then be like, oh, yeah, Jeff was really clever there? But it takes them out of that experience if they have to do that. And so finding a way to broaden my scope rather than being really specific about those details and trying to show the discipline to do that is very much so a part of my process as I'm working on the different drafts of poems.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. I think that summarizes the conversation very well. The way that we all have to deal with our personal experience, but in doing so, we have to do it in a way that has windows in it for people to see what's going on rather than simply saying, but that's the way it was. Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts? Anything else from Morgan? Okay. So we have exhausted our questions. If there's anything else you want to say, let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll wrap up for today. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm so glad to have Nicole and Andrew and Jeff here with us today. This has been an excellent panel. And for Pier-Glass Poetry Panels, we'll look for you next time. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.